I'm Dave Rao with Paragon Consulting Group, and I've been doing water rights engineering pretty much my whole career since the 80s. Mike Hein from the State Engineer's Office. Do I need this or no?
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yes.
Mike Hein from the State Engineer's Office, he and I have coordinated a little bit. So I'm going to speak, and then Mike's going to speak, and then we'll answer questions together, just because we don't have a lot of time for this. So I think the first question is, why are we even talking about water rights? This is a wetlands workshop, and as you heard earlier, you need water to make this all work. So we need water for seasonal wetlands. I'm going to provide a little bit of an editorial comment, and hopefully you guys can help spread the word. One of the issues we run into in doing these change cases is the objectors often think of wetlands as a pond that's permanently full of water with cattails and bulrushes going on. And as everybody knows, that's not really what we're shooting for. But we run into that perception on the part of objectors on a fairly routine basis. So as a group, if there's anything we can do to sort of spread the word of what we're looking for, that would help. As you know, in Colorado, water rights are very regulated. It's what keeps Mike employed, keeps me employed, keeps Kevin Warner employed. The process takes a lot of planning, a lot of time, and regretfully a lot of money. If you embark on one of these projects to do a change case or to try and establish a water right, you need a really good team, you need people who understand what you're trying to accomplish, and you need a lot of patience, right, Mark? You don't just flip a pump on. Wetland uses, this is kind of what we're all striving for. This is a section of the, next to the Platte River, and it's flooded to create those wetlands. This wasn't this year. The wetlands water uses are sometimes not quite well understood, again, by the standard water community. One of the uses is irrigation. Another use you can get out of these projects is recharge, and that's one thing that groups like Ducks Unlimited, and Richard, I think you guys are doing some of this too, these combined projects, where you create a wetland, but you can also create a recharge pond and team with other groups that benefit from that recharge. Augmentation, storage, which is kind of a hot button for a lot of people, and wildlife habitat. Those are the primary uses I see for water rights in this scenario. The legal process, if you're doing a change, what you're going to have to do is go ahead and document your past uses and then very well describe your future uses and present that in an application. I'll spend a little more time on it. If you're establishing a new water right, you don't have to document your past uses. You're just trying to establish a new water right. Again, on the past uses, it's typically irrigation. You're typically transferring ag right. So you're going to go back and look at where this water was used, how the irrigation occurred, where it occurred, and then develop the historic consumptive use. The water right could also include augmentation, storage, or another change in use. It could have been changed already. The timing of the process, the first thing you do is prepare an application, and the application will describe the water right in question, either the one you're trying to change or the new one you're trying to establish, how you're going to use it, and what the beneficial uses will be, and how you're going to operate your water right, your augmentation pond, or your wetland. So there's a fair amount of detail, and it's usually done, the lawyer and engineer working together with the client to establish what the applicant wants, and then how we can back it up with engineering and maybe change what the what we actually get, and then you work with the lawyer to prepare the application. The application engineering report should work hand in hand with the engineering report supporting the application. Then the application is published in the water resume, and it typically takes a month. So if you file in August, it's typically published in September, and then the objectors have till the end of the following month to object. They'll file an objection. And sometimes people file an objection just because they want to see what's going on. Sometimes they really do have some serious objections about what you're trying to do. That's the objection period I talked about. Then we'll typically prepare the engineering report and publish that. And that will sort of get the ball rolling. The objectors look at the engineering report, their engineers look at it, and then I'll get ahead of myself, but then the litigation will ensue, because what most people don't really understand is that water rights changes in Colorado are really a civil litigation action. It's like a lawsuit. So there are rules of communication, there are certain procedures that need to be followed, certain timelines that need to be met, and the rules changed recently to try and move things along a little bit. In the meantime, after you filed your application, you can actually file what's called a substitute water supply plan. Some people have been doing this for a long time. We'll call them temporary substitute supply plans. But it's basically a plan that's submitted. Objectors and other people on the river have a chance to comment on it. And then the Division of Water Resources, State Engineer's Office, will review that substitute water supply plan and either comment on it and ask you to change it or approve it. But that plan basically gives you the ability to operate for a 1-year period consistent with your application, hopefully. And you can do this for up to 5 years without any kind of waiver. So it allows you to operate as your water change case is working through the system. But then eventually you'll get to a decree, which is sort of the golden ring you're searching for, which establishes your water right on a permanent basis. So what the decree will include is the background. It's kind of like a lot of legal documents. It's called the whereas. It's all the background, what water rights are involved, where they're going, description of the property, description of the beneficial uses, etc. It'll also be very particular about the location, particularly with hog ponds and stuff. It's a surveyed location where you can conduct the activity of recharge or augmentation. It'll describe the beneficial uses, and you'll be limited to those beneficial uses. If you want to enlarge the universe of beneficial uses that you want to use your water for, then you're going to have to go and do another change case. So it's really important to figure out what you want before you embark on one of these. It'll discuss the timing, when you can use water, how you report on your uses, that kind of thing. In the decree, there'll be operational requirements. For example, in an OG plan, there's usually a projection tool. So you say, here's what I'm going to do for the next year. Here's how I'm showing that I'm using water in a certain way, and I'm going to have certain consumptive uses, and I have enough accretions or enough other water to make up for those depletions that occurred out of priority. So there are a lot of knickknacks that go into the terms and conditions, and often that's where the fight is. The engineers usually can settle on consumptive use and that kind of stuff pretty quickly. It's these terms and conditions where there's a lot of back and forth, and people trying to tell you how you're going to operate, and you're saying, no, I want flexibility. So, with that, we can open it up to questions, but we'll let Mike talk first, and then
sure.
Questions.
All right, well, Dave did a very good job of laying out the overall process. Where we come into play, just to kind of put it all into perspective for you, is we are the administrators. You get the golden ring, then it's up to us to make sure that, as long as that decree or that plan operates, you're operating in accordance with those terms and conditions. And really at the forefront of that is our water commissioners. We have a water commissioner for each of the districts, specifically to what you guys are talking about would be 1 and 64, and we'll kind of just show you where those are. Division 1, just to give you an overview of where it sits within the state, we have a lot of ground to cover. Essentially a continental divide, Palmer divide on the south, and then the state lines to the east and to the north. As I mentioned, we have districts 1 and 64, which is the lower end of the South Platte. And those, as you can see, the division line between 1 and 64 is the Washington County line, which is going to be important in some future slides. But just to give you an idea, that's, and we have a commissioner, of course, like I said, in each one of these districts, and deputies as well. I always like to show this just to give you a perspective on the water availability, or the water that we measure in our streams. You can obviously tell to the west here they've got some fairly significant flows, and of course these arrows as you see them are proportionate to the amount of water. Just to give you some perspective, but the South Platte, we definitely utilize it pretty efficiently. See that flow diminishes as we go east. I also like to give you a perspective on how these rights were appropriated, just to kind of put it into, to kind of give you an idea as to the adjudication and how that began. We have all of the majority of the senior rights up in the tributary districts demarked by the letter A in green. Those are the ones that were appropriated in the early 1860s from some of the first rights. Then when the return flows from those rights started to accumulate and formed a live flowing stream, because as we all know, the Platte was seasonal at best. And then once we started getting return flows flowing, there was an ability to appropriate water in the section on B, which is Denver to Kersey in this depiction. And then it progressed out east with the most junior of the senior rights, irrigation rights out east. And this is a point flow diagram. Just to set it up a little bit, in November 17th, the day prior, we had just taken the call off. So there was a call on the river. And just to kind of step back, what I mean by call is every day the water commissioner evaluates the demand versus the supply in the system. And if the demand exceeds the supply, then that water right holder has the right to place a call. And if they feel that they are not getting their full entitlement. And then the water commissioner will administer that call to ensure that any junior rights upstream of that calling right are curtailed. And that's the game, or not a game, rather, but that's the job of the water commissioner on a daily basis. But the point of the point flow, I mentioned return flows. What we have here is at the Kersey gauge, we have about 600 CFS in the river. And then the first diversion is the Riverside and Empire diversion, and they take off about 400 CFS. But notice the incline in the graph, that's all return flow water. That's what's coming back to the river. That's what's feeding the next diverter, which in this case is the Jackson Lake Inlet. And just to put it in perspective, this is the winter months when we'll probably see the opportunity for more availability for what's free river or open rivers, depending upon how you refer to it. And that's when that's essentially by definition, all rights are satisfied that are calling. So, and we do have certain times of the year, this is the storage season. So all the storage season rights per se on the 17th of November were satisfied, but they were still diverting. So everything at their head gate, they have enough water to satisfy their needs. And then I talked about free river. One of the questions that was asked to us is, when can we expect, or when do you see normally free river conditions on the South Platte, lower end specifically? In Water District 1 above the North Sterling or the Pruitt Inlets, I don't know how familiar you are with where those are locally, but those are more to the west than where we are today, but I'm sorry, to the east than where we are today. But typically above there is a call pretty much all winter. The gentleman's agreement, you may have referred to that or heard of that before. That is no longer the way Water Administration operates. Senior storage rights are calling in the winter generally, and specifically above these structures. Below the North Sterling and the Pruitt Inlets, average to wet years, you'll see what I just showed you. They're diverting water, but they're not generally calling because there's enough water to satisfy diversion. But in dry years, we'll see Julesburg Reservoir, jumbo call. They usually come on in November to December, and then the river, their inlet ditch is the Harmony, and that freezes out, and then they won't be able to come back in and top off until March when things thaw out. So just to give you a perspective, but I got to caveat that, we got to make sure all the senior decreed rights are satisfied, including recharge rights. And I mentioned the Washington County line. That is the demarcation point for what we have to administer during the summer months up until at least October 15th, the South Platte Compact. And it only affects District 64 essentially, and that's kind of what created that district, if you will. But we got to make sure that there's 120 CFS to satisfy our neighbors to the east. And then, but from essentially October to March 31st, we can take full diversion of the river without having to be. I just want to make note, and I'm sure you all know, but the South Platte is definitely over appropriated. There are more water rights out there generally than there are availability for the better part of the year. Free river is something we still see. It's not as frequent as we used to see it. And people say going forward it's going to be less frequent because we are starting to decree water rights. We're still decreeing water rights. There are water rights currently in water court with 2013 appropriation dates or adjudication dates, and we'll foresee that into the future. So, we do experience shortages, and that's when we place calls, and almost always through the summer. We'll see an 1860s to 1890s call on them. Right now, we're currently under a call, and we're drying the river in about 5 places. And as David Rao mentioned, augmentation plans are critical for any out of priority diversions to make sure that those senior water rights are satisfied and are not injured. And that's kind of the game that David was articulating to you, is those senior rights want to make sure that if you make a diversion off of the river, what's considered an out of priority diversion or diversion, a junior diversion against a senior call, that you are making an augmentation release to ensure that that water that would have historically been there is still physically there, available for diversion by the senior. I want to wrap up with maybe some final thoughts. One of the things that we oftentimes find as a surprise to people is, water flowing in sloughs, small drainages, even from springs. Those are all subject to the call. So if there's a call on the river where it is tributary to that source, that source, that flowing in that slough is subject to the call, and can only be diverted when in priority. One of the ancillary benefits that David mentioned is recharge for some of these projects. One of the things that we always like to make, one of the things that the decrees are very explicit is the calculation of recharge. And what they take into account is a lot of the consumption for phreatophytes or growth in there. That's an uptake that needs to reduce the actual recharge amount. So those kinds of things, just a little bit of caution there. And we have a recharge protocol out there that I'd like to encourage everybody that's interested in recharge projects to at least get familiar with. And unfortunately, Brent, who was going to be here today, who is one of the lead commissioners, Brent Shantz, well, used to be a lead commissioner in 1 and 64, and now is the supervisor for those districts. He wanted me to at least stress to you that, pick up the phone and give us a call if you're getting ready to build something or thinking about doing something. These guys know the river just as well as anybody does. So I'd like to at least, get that plug out there for him that they are available. So with that, I know we're holding questions, but all that.
I just got a couple things real quick. I'm Richard Vail. I work for Parks and Wildlife, Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I'm the water resources engineer. I spend my time defending the state's water rights on all of our state wildlife areas all around the state. And Elliott, that we're going to see this afternoon, is kind of near and dear to my heart. I used to work for Ducks Unlimited. I helped build the thing, and I wanted to talk a little bit about moist soil impoundments that we've been talking about this morning. Elliott, we use a senior direct flow irrigation right to operate the facility. And so all this talk about change cases and augmentation plans and all that stuff is outside of the realm of how we operate the kind of a flow through right on this whole system. So I'd be glad to, while we're out there, I can certainly answer questions or anything like that. But all the things I heard this morning when we were talking about seed production and invertebrate production, and everything was put in terms of pounds per acre. To me, it makes it sound just like any other crop. We irrigate wetlands, using a direct flow irrigation right, just like a farmer would, irrigating alfalfa or corn or anything like that. We like to treat wetland vegetation in the same similar manner, and I think everything that we saw this morning pretty much points to that. With that, I'll leave it to these guys to answer all the hard questions, but I'll be out on the site this afternoon. I'll be glad to talk to anybody about how this thing works and what all went into it and that sort of thing.
So can I ask a question then?
Well, let me add one thing to what Richard said. The way I look at this is when you're irrigating a wetland, you're growing a crop. And it's not like alfalfa where you go out and you combine and bale it and sell it. You're more like a rancher. A rancher really grows grass. They just tend to harvest it with livestock. And we're growing seeds and invertebrates and harvesting them with waterfowl. So it's not all that different. But there's a lot of discussion about that, particularly in Mike's office, about this whole thing, because this is kind of a newer beneficial use. Although it's always been there, it's just being managed more actively. And as water gets short, everybody starts looking around.
And Brent Shantz, that Michael referred to, has been really great to work with on these things. We operate under the 72-hour rule, if any of you guys understand that policy, but the system on Elliott pretty much flows through continuously, so we feel like we're in compliance with that 72-hour holding rule. So anyway, I can explain that later when we're on the site.
I'll also echo what Mike said. His office is great about coming out and meeting with you if you're working on a project. Brent's willing to come out. They're incredibly knowledgeable, and if you spend a little time with them up front, a lot of times you can save a lot of money and heartache and pain down the road. With that, questions, I guess.
Well, maybe we'll ask a question out in the field, but that, the right of either having an aug right or a irrigation or an ag right, having water rights are two different things.
They're oranges and apples there.
Sure, but I'm hearing that you potentially could apply, if it's within the 72-hour rule, that you're actually irrigating and you're not pounding and holding.
Yeah, so we divert in priority. We have
if you do it right.
Well, so it's significant whether, if you do it right, you may be saving a right, water that you don't have to use otherwise, because you're within a irrigation schedule versus calling it an impoundment. And so,
Well, it's not what
but
you
maybe
call
I'll
it,
ask you.
It's actually what you do.
Well, sure. No, I get
it
that.
gets awfully complicated, but
I'd like to ask you that out in the field.
Okay.
See how that-
And one of the things too is the irrigation season. We will close the irrigation season when we see no further active growth and the storage season starts to come in. That's
where we have a problem.
That's usually around, it's the magic date of November 1st when we start seeing storage calls come in. And we've got some pretty senior rights, early 1900s, so.
I got a question about the vegetation management in recharge areas or whatnot. You mentioned phreatophytes you subtract for that. Is there a policy for other vegetation growing in wetland basins that has to be managed, or throughout the growing?
No,
season?
not necessarily. I mean, what's unique about a recharge versus what you would consider your wetlands management project is wetlands management, as long as the water is diverted in priority and used for that, there's no deduction for any uptake. But with recharge, it's unique because you're trying to create augmentation credits to be later used by something, by somebody. And we want to make sure that that water that actually accretes into the alluvial aquifer is accurately accredited to the aquifer. And we need to deduct anything that would uptake that in its path downward. So.
Okay, some of these, the wetland management we're talking about does occur on recharge situations. So,
yeah, I mean, to give you a perfect scenario for a recharge site, our water commissioners will have the owners spray and cut the weeds completely. I mean, it should be a barren hole in the ground because the objective there is to get the water into the groundwater and into the alluvial aquifer to create these accretions. That's the function.
Right.
So that's
Although
from
if you don't do that, you can subtract 4.
right. I'm not saying
Vegetation,
that.
vegetation.
But that's all decreed in water court. So on several of ours, we have an accounting sheet that actually deducts for vegetation.
Right. And it's all in there, and there are parameters in there, and that's what we have to administer.
So when the water goes in there, it needs to be bare. For instance, if it's
No, it doesn't
Okay.
have to be.
okay,
It's just a water balance. So let's just use
You're
an
not getting
example.
as much recharge credit
Right.
because it's being
Okay.
consumed by vegetation.
The way you analyze it is I'll put 100 acre-feet of water in a recharge site. And then I'll have some evaporative loss, which happens whether it's bare or not. So I have to subtract that off. And then I subtract off any consumptive use by vegetation. The remainders would actually goes into the ground and moves back to the river. So the accounting takes all those factors into account, plus the timing back to the river. Because you'll get a hydrograph back to the river too, you don't just get a slump. So that's, their office gets flooded. In fact, I've got one I gotta work on tomorrow. Accounting's due within 30 days of the end of the month, so.
Yeah, what I articulated is for just a recharge project. That's the function. Yeah, what Dave is talking about is, the habitat creation, and you want the phreatophytes there, but you just have to account for
Yeah, pure recharge, you want it, one scale.
yeah, right.
You got to talk, sir. She can ask a question
Is there a difference between augmentation and recharge? I hear those terms a lot.
first.
And
Yeah, one begins
some
with an
people
A,
use
one
it.
begins with an R. No. You can probably do a little better job.
that.
You might not like my answer.
Augmentation is the end product of effective. Well, what an augmentation is supposed to do, it's supposed to augment an out of priority diversion. It's to augment the river to ensure that the senior that expected to see the water is actually physically there. So you're augmenting your out of priority diversion with some injury in the future. But recharge is a function of actually creating that augmentation. So you put water into a recharge site, and then you create an accretion. And when that accretion hits the river, then it can augment, if necessary, it can augment that potential future injury that you're trying to mitigate or augment. In a sense, the same mitigation, augment, kind of the same.
So is that confusing enough? Here's how I look at it.
use them interchangeably.
Yeah,
They're really not interchangeable. They're kind of different.
Yeah.
To me, augmentation is sort of, you're covering something after the fact. Recharge, you're sort of creating something into the future.
Sorry.
Does that make sense to you? And the terms are often used interchangeably, but also in a decree there, people get pretty particular with you about whether you're augmenting or recharging.
You create a recharge pond in order to augment,
Right.
Yeah, there you go.
but then why would you create an augmentation pond? Like, is that a?
Because you didn't use the word recharge pond.
It gets more complicated. You can pump water up and down the hill.
Yeah.
And so then you're, doing all it.
Yeah, we could spend a whole week on this.
Yeah, it's nice explaining all this in 30 minutes right
Yeah.
now.
Go ahead, sorry.
So in your water accounting, you mentioned phreatophytes, but do you look at,
He mentioned phreatophytes, I never said that word.
You call them something much nicer.
do you look at different,
To me, a phreatophyte's a very narrow type of vegetation. And
Do you
he
look at-
doesn't really mean that, he means all vegetation.
All vegetation.
Yeah,
You
we
have
don't
different-
look at specific, all of our decrees, it's vegetation exists or not.
Yeah.
It's
is
all.
vegetated or not?
Yeah.
Right.
And
Phreatophyte's kind
Any
of an old
evapotranspiration.
yeah.
Any
Phreatophyte's an
evapotranspiration.
old term of art that's carried over, and to people like you, that
I'm
means
trying to
something
use your
real specific.
terminology.
Go ahead.
But I'm trying to use your terminology.
Okay, vegetative consumptive use?
So then how does generally that compare to open water evaporative loss?
Depends on the time of year. Depends on the time of year. Sometimes it's much higher, sometimes it's lower.
So averaged out over a whole year.
You'll see vegetative CU is probably
An
higher.
acre of cattails versus a.
Oh,
acre
don't
of-
even go to cattails. Cattails are huge water users. You sound like Sterling.
We need to get him down to Division
The
2.
baseline open water is 48 inches a year, 46, something like that.
Depends on where you are.
Yeah, it depends on where you are. But I actually just recently looked at that in a case where we were negotiating with the opposers, and it was really interesting. What the opposers were fighting about and what they were proposing actually was contrary to what they were trying to achieve. Because I went and looked at it, and I was like, whoa, yeah, we could go with that. Because they were trying to hammer us on the evaporative loss versus the vegetative loss. And it was really interesting. During different times of year, it was different. And it was on a wetlands project. In the fall, the vegetative CU was much, much higher than the evaporative loss. Because there wasn't much evaporative loss, but the plants were going to town. Yes, sir.
You made a comment earlier about blew me away. Are they brand new water rights on the South Platte River?
Oh, yeah, you can. That's why Free River's going away.
Free River's still free.
On a river that's already over appropriated, they're brand new water.
Over appropriated, I think,
Certain times.
what
of
Mike
year,
said.
Since it's a gaining stream, depending on the year. But a 2013 recharge right, may only produce water, I don't know, 2 years in 10.
2 hours
I don't
out
know.
of the year.
Yeah, something like, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But you could still have a right, it's still gonna be better than a 2015.
Well, yeah.
What Michael says is it's generally over appropriated. There are still times when there's a free river. So if you file a direct flow water right today, and you have a place to put it in a beneficial use, you might only get water 1 out of every 10 years. But
But you still have
you
the right.
have a right.
Okay.
And the guy who was living on Free River, since you've established your right, he's probably got less days of Free River in the future.
And part of the engineering reports that are prepared do that analysis. They do an analysis to show that there are periods of free river available to make this diversion. And oftentimes, if you look at the history records, you can pick out of the timeline several periods where there were free river there. So.
I was going through the water rights on this stretch of the river pretty carefully for a case I'm working on for Mark. And there was a few years ago, where there was no call on the river for over a year.
Well, there's
But
2
there are
years
also
in a row,
times,
just year before that,
yeah.
11, 10 and 11.
But then there's times like now where, there's been a call on the river for,
Yeah, since last
June 2012 or something. So it just depends. A water right just gives you an opportunity if the river can yield the water. Yeah.
Can you maybe throw just some generic numbers of what it would cost to wage your services to determine if there's water rights available and then getting them decreed? I don't know.
Oh, that's a really big question.
That's a big
Checking to
one.
see if they're available, you know, that's probably a $5,000 or $1,000 endeavor. Doing a water right change case in the South Platte now has gone from when I started my career, an OG plan was maybe 4 pages. You got water back during the irrigation season, you got water back during the storage season, you were good to go. Now, Michael's office wants to see it daily, and I'm waiting for instantaneous. Now, a change case on the rivers, $50,000 to $150,000. And you can thank certain groups for boosting that cost.
Would a new decree cost about the same?
Probably. There's some people on the river that upstream that don't like people down here, and so they stick their nose in every case and make you spend a lot of money. It keeps the riffraff out, and the lawyers' kids need to go to college too. So.
And one important thing is the reason why we're daily is every morning at 8 a.m. we may make a call change, and sometimes we make the call change twice a day. So, I mean, that daily is really critical for us because the river is dynamic, the demand is dynamic.
And it changes every year. Like this year, it was really weird. There would be a ton of water at Kersey. I think you and I and Brent talked about this when we were out at Marks. There's a ton of water at Kersey. There was still a call on the river down at the Nebraska line, which killed everybody up here. And it was because I think you and I chatted about this. We had all that dry period, and the river was really low last year, like it is today. I don't know if anyone's looked at the river today. It was really low. And so you're getting all that bank storage that Rick talked about. It drained. And then this spring, that water wasn't making it to Nebraska. It was filling that storage back up in the bank. So it was really interesting to see the river. It just, instead of being a gainer this year, it was kind of a loser as I went to Nebraska. It was really interesting. Wasn't very helpful for people, but as an engineer, I thought it was really interesting. So, any other questions? Great, thanks.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming, Michael and Dave, Richard.
Thanks, Richard.
Yeah.